Mujiji ki Jai, Anantaji ki Jai, Christ ki Jai. Namaste, welcome to the Advaita channel. I felt to do a short meditation this morning, a guided meditation or contemplation. So we'll do that first, just about 5 minutes.
I want to ask you, scanning inwardly, who is inside here? Scanning inwardly with a light of introspection. Who is dwelling inside here? Some entity? Can you find you? Are there some coordinates we can follow to reach where you are? Is there you? If there is space, is there some worry that this is not responsible to be like this? Who will take care of my life? How can I live like this if there's only space here? Is there something inwardly that is interested in truth, along with football and shopping and things? Are you empty or full? Is there you that has an agenda, intention? Is there a context for your existence that is important for you? Are you filled with noise? Or do you not know what it means to be empty or full? Are you finding you know nothing and you are no thing? Is there something that you need to salvage? Are you burning too quickly? Is self-consciousness holding you back? Is that sense there? Do you have an appointment with something that keeps freedom waiting? Is it too costly to allow yourself to simply be? Who will you disappoint? Does later have more appeal than now? Are you waiting to go beyond? Or can you see that these are ideas rising in what you timelessly are? If freedom is in one hand, what is in the other hand? If you are already empty, remain as you are. If you are not
So I am reading from Adyashanti's Resurrecting Jesus, and we're starting on page 65. This is a bit of a repeat from Bhagavati's read. Hoping you can hear me okay. Turn the heater off. That should make the sound a little bit better for you. It's called Trials and Tribulations. Trials and Tribulations, page 65. From St. Teresa of Avila. The quote is, "To have courage for whatever comes in life. Everything lies in that." So the pointing here perhaps is just to remain without aversion or attraction, just allowing. And even if aversion or attraction arises, we just remain as seeing, natural. So Adyashanti says, after awakening, we enter into the next phase of the spiritual journey. In awakening, we suddenly recognize our true nature. We recognize that we are not the egoic personality we thought we were, but divine beings. The radiance of consciousness itself. At some point following this recognition, it's as if the world responds by giving us very specific tests and trials in which we will be asked to engage life from the awakened state, to manifest it and to act from it. Realizing reality of our being is one thing, but being able to embody it is something else entirely. The trials and tribulations of life are challenging, but they actually help us begin to act and manifest our realization in the world of time and space in our daily lives. If we look at the life of Jesus, we see it was one long, continuous trial that shows us time and again how spirit moves in the world of time and space. The first temptation. Immediately following this awakening, Jesus enters the wilderness to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. The Gospel of Matthew says, in quotes, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." Matthew 4:1 NIV. This motif of entering a place of tests and trials is very ancient, very universal. The Buddha had much the same experience under the Bodhi tree. The Bodhi tree is really symbolic for the tree of life. So the Buddha is sitting in a lush place quite different than the desert where Jesus goes. Yet he is tempted in equal measure, assaulted by the forces of Maya. In Buddhism, Maya represents illusion. It plays the same role as Satan or the devil in Christianity. The difference is that Maya is the impersonal force of illusion and misunderstanding in the universe. It's not out to destroy with evil intent. In the Christian story, Satan is the personification of illusion, and because of this, Satan takes on a much darker, more sinister quality. So Jesus is led out into the desert where he encounters Satan. Quote, "After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.'" Matthew 4:2-3 NIV. Now, imagine that you fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. You're going to be tired, and you're going to be hungry, and you're going to be weak. Along comes this dark force, whether something from outside you or inside you, to tempt you at this moment of weakness. What it essentially says is, I know you're hungry, so if you're really a great awakened being, just do it. Just turn these rocks into bread. And Jesus answers Satan, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Matthew 4:4 NIV. This first temptation has to do with the issues of fear and survival, which are really two sides of a single extraordinarily powerful force. So this first temptation asks us, when you get afraid, when your well-being and even survival are at stake, what do you fall back on? From where do your decisions arise? When you are afraid, do your decisions arise from fear? When you feel threatened, do you respond from your old conditioned sense of self-protection, or do you still maintain a connection with that still point inside, that point of clarity and love inside you, where you're not afraid even when you're afraid? The place where love is greater than the instinct to survive. I'll read that part again. When you feel threatened, do you respond from your old conditioned sense of self-protection, or do you still maintain a connection with that still point inside, that point of clarity and love inside you, where you're not afraid even when you're afraid? The place where love is greater than the instinct to survive. Very beautiful. That place inside allows you to move through your fear, through even the desire to survive. We're often taught that our deepest instinct is the survival instinct, that when push comes to shove, all life forms in the whole universe seek first and foremost to survive. But in human beings, at least, we find that this isn't actually the case. There are times in life where people are more than willing to put their lives on the line for someone or something, because there's a love that is deeper than the survival instinct that they can access and function through. Just gonna move my dog. Imagine a parent whose child is out in the middle of the street with a car barreling toward them. You see in an instant that your only chance to save your child is to run out in the street and push them out of harm's way. There's not enough time to carry them to safety. Most parents would run right out in front of the car and push their child out of the way, even if they knew they were going to be struck and killed by the car. Most parents wouldn't even have to think. It would be an instinctive, instantaneous action. At such moments, we have transcended personal survival and tapped into our collective unity. Mm. Something similar, though not as dramatic, occurs when you feel real compassion or sympathy for someone. Each person's experience is his or her own, but when you meet someone who's suffering and you're open to them, available to them, you partake in their experience. Sure, it would be easier for you if you didn't partake of their experience, if you simply closed your heart and didn't have any compassion. But the human heart has a deep capacity for connection. I would suggest that our innate compassion arises from the intuition that we are not separate, that your concern is in some way mine as well, that your suffering is my suffering. This transcends separation and the desire for survival. This part of the Jesus story with Satan and the temptations in the desert can seem abstract and kind of fanciful, but if you look at what the underlying metaphors are trying to say, you'll find that it actually relates very much to your daily life. There are many moments in any given week that life asks us, where are you going to operate from? What's your intention? What do you really value? Do you value connectedness and deep truth, or do you value fear and survival? It's easy to say you value connection and truth, but when you are put in the situation where you feel uncertain, where you cannot know the outcome, when acting from the deepest truth and love will cost you something, what are you going to do? What do you value the most? This is what Jesus is encountering here. The second temptation. The second temptation has to do with hubris. I think we've all experienced hubris at times when we get a little too high on ourselves or think we're a little nobler than we actually are. Hubris, in this sense, can be unintentional, but in its darker aspect, hubris becomes real arrogance to the point of delusion. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' next temptation is described like this. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Matthew 4:5-6 NIV. What Satan is saying here is, you're so great. Look what you've realized. Now prove it to me. Show off for me. Be someone special for me. Exercise this great enlightenment that you have. And Jesus answers him sharply, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Do not put the Lord your God to the test." Matthew 4:7 NIV. It's such a simple answer. It may seem antiquated, but what he's really saying is, I won't show off, even though I'm the Son of God. I'm not going to announce it. I'm not going to go out and prove it. I know, and that's enough. I will not be tempted to misuse this power. And as a human being, it is enough that you know. Or do you always have to be acknowledged for what you know? Do you have to seek out attention? Do you have to show off? Or if you attain great powers, will you be tempted into using them for self-serving purposes? Once again, what Jesus is showing us is what it looks like to to align with our deeper truth. That's what is being conveyed. When tested, what do you align with? Let me give two examples of how spiritual hubris might look. One is personal and one is more observational. The personal example occurred not too long after my first awakening, which happened when I was 25 years old. Some months after that awakening, I was at my teacher's house where I went every week meditating with other students. I remember as I was sitting there meditating, all of a sudden, the sense of arrogance arose, and I found myself feeling very spiritually elevated compared to everyone else in the room. Even at the time, it was horrific to me. Those thoughts would go through my mind of how much better I was than the others because I'd had this realization and they had not. This was hubris in the form of arrogance. It emerged from somewhere deep in the subconscious, and when it rose to the surface, it shocked and horrified me. Luckily, as soon as it arose, I saw it and knew it was ridiculous. I certainly didn't act on it. In fact, as I sat there, I tried all sorts of things to get rid of it. First, I just tried to resist it. I kept telling myself, I know this isn't true. I know this isn't real. But why is it happening? And so the weeks went by, but each Sunday morning when I'd go visit my teacher and be with the other students, the same thing would happen as soon as I sat down. I even had a term for it inside of me. I called it arrogant guy. After resisting, which I knew wouldn't work anyway, I tried to accept it. Then I tried to lovingly, compassionately embrace the arrogance. I tried every trick in the book. After about 2 months of this recurring thought stream of arrogance arising in my mind, I was once again with my teacher on Sunday morning, sitting with a group of students, and once again I was meditating. Arrogant guy arose. I finally just realized there's nothing I can do about it. I can't get rid of it through hating it. I can't get rid of it through understanding. I can't get rid of it through understanding it. So in that moment, I didn't try to do anything with it at all. I just saw it arise. No resistance, no indulgence, nothing. And when it arose in that space where there was no relationship with it, all of a sudden it literally just popped like a bubble. and it was gone. And I have to tell you, I was really, really relieved. So I was lucky in that instance because I knew that it wasn't true. I knew it was arrogance and saw it for what it was, but still I had to go through it. I've seen many people over lots of years have awakening experiences, and I have seen many ways that this hubris can display itself. In Zen, we call this sort of hubris drunk on emptiness. The word emptiness means something akin to the word spirit. So, drunk on emptiness suggests a sort of exuberance for the awakened state itself. When the awakened state first appears, often it's so new, so unexpected, that there's a certain kind of exaltation. It's simply part of the energy field of the awakened state, especially at the beginning. And it's very easy to get caught in the exuberance, like having a new toy to play with. Most people who experience this spiritual hubris are not ill-intentioned, but nonetheless, we can begin to lose touch with the very human dimension of life. We can become full of ourselves and go around telling everybody that we know what's true. That's a very obvious form of arrogance. Another form of hubris occurs when we are so taken up into our exalted state that we stop paying attention to our relative life. There's a story that really highlights this, and it involves my teacher's teacher. Her teacher, a Zen master who had come over from Japan, was meeting with one of his senior students who had a wife and several children. One day, the teacher asked him, "So, how's your wife? How's your kids?" The student said, "You know, it's not really going well." The teacher said, "So tell me what's going on." "Well," the student said, "my wife says I'm not paying attention to her, and my kids say I'm not spending time with them." And the teacher asked, "Well, are you?" In reply, "Well, since I had this big spiritual shift, my spiritual life is comparatively so much more vital." The student answered, "It seems like this is the reality, and my family life doesn't seem as compelling or real to me anymore." There was a retreat coming up, and the teacher said, "I want both you and your wife to come to the next retreat." Well, being a good student, he agreed, and his wife agreed as well. And so they came to the retreat thinking that they would be sitting in meditation like you do at Zen retreats. Instead, the teacher called them both up and said, "I've set aside a room just for you. There's a bed in that room, and I want you both to spend the next 24 hours on that bed together. I don't care what you talk about. If you don't talk at all, if you are on opposite ends of the bed, I just want you to stay on that bed." The next day they came back, and the teacher said, how is it going?" "Well," the student said, after about 10 hours on that bed, we started to have a chat, and we began to relate a little more." "Well, that's good," said the teacher. "Now I want you to spend another 24 hours on that bed together." And so it went over the entire 7-day retreat. They literally spent 7 days on a bed together. What happened over those 7 days is that when the student had to be with his wife and to confront what he was avoiding, eventually his own hubris started to break down. His sense of superiority, his sense that his wife and family couldn't understand him, his sense that they weren't as inherently valuable as the ultimate truth he realized. All of it started to break down over those 7 days, and they started to talk and relate once again. It saved his marriage. It saved his relationship with his kids. In a sense, it brought him back down to earth, not by pulling him out of what he realized, but by grounding the raw energy of the awakened state back into life and back into his family. He was very lucky that he had a family, because if you don't have something that can ground you, you can get really off balance at such times. It's good to be reminded that hubris, left unchecked, can have serious consequences in our lives. If we don't notice soon enough, we might just realize too late that we've lost some very important things in our lives. The beauty of the story is that it reminds us, keep your feet firmly planted on the soil, keep your consciousness and your heart open, and stay available to this relative world and all the human beings within it. The third temptation. The third temptation is all about power, and certainly our world has many examples of people who've been tempted by power. Maybe we just take a moment and before we go on and reflect. The third temptation. The third temptation is all about power. And certainly our world has many examples of people who've been tempted by power. People are willing to sacrifice their morality, their sense of right and wrong for money or power or influence. We see this on display in the political arena, where people will say almost anything to get a vote. They'll say one thing one week and the opposite thing the next week. On a personal level, each of us in our lives can see this temptation at work, in big ways or small, where we're selling out for power and influence to get ahead, to secure what our egos want. This desire for power is a perennial theme in the human story. Now, in the Jesus story, this temptation takes on a mythic form. In Matthew, during the third temptation, it says, in quotes, "Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you," he said, "if you bow down and worship me." Matthew 4, 8 and 9, NIV. Satan is saying, bow down and forsake the truth. Forsake that still small voice within you that knows the correct orientation and give yourself to illusion. Do this and you can have everything. Jesus said to him, this is in quotes, Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Matthew 4:10, NIV. When this temptation for power arises, Jesus says, away from me. Sorry, forget it. I'm not buying it. Now, remember, Satan is not out there in the world, but a personification of internal forces of darkness. Satan represents what in our modern vernacular we would call the inner shadow. Satan is that voice in the back of your mind, and maybe for some people right in the front, that says, get what you can as fast as you can. Take advantage. That's what you really want to do. The teaching here is about what it looks like to stay aligned with the vital force of the universe, aligned with your love, aligned with what you really know to be true. This alignment is different than simply doing the right thing. These are not ultimately moral or ethical questions, though they have moral and ethical consequences. But Jesus is engaged here on an entirely different level. This is someone who has had a deep spiritual shift. He awakened to his true nature, and he knows himself to be divine being. What trials and temptations might arise to one who has realized himself as divine being? You might think that all that shadow material would be dispelled and immediately disappear upon awakening, and much of it does. But awakening itself will scour the deep realms and shadow areas of the unconscious and bring it up into consciousness. Thus, it's very common that people who have had deep and significant spiritual awakenings will at some point have to meet their inner shadow at a very deep, fundamental level. Through dealing with this shadow material, we become more and more aligned, but not with ideas of right or wrong, good or bad. There is a different kind of alignment here, an alignment with that inner sense of spiritual reality, love, and divine being. Coming into alignment. Once Jesus has passed these tests, he comes back out of the wilderness. He's dealt with the deepest shadow material. He's met every weakness. He's found that under pressure, he aligns himself with the deeper reality no matter what. And this theme of aligning with the truth, aligning with the deeper spiritual reality of oneness, will be a theme that runs throughout the gospel stories, just as it's a theme that runs through all of our lives. Am I going to be truthful? Am I going to live from that reality? Am I going to be open right here, right now? These may seem like simple questions, but at any given moment, for example, when you're talking to someone and an argument or disagreement arises, it can be so easy to go into that reactive place of the mind that wants to be right, that demands to be understood, or wants to win. With what do we align ourselves at that moment? What do we value? What do we really want at that moment? If we remain in alignment with our spiritual being, then we are connected to a deep state of quiet clarity and love in which we have not disconnected from one another. As soon as you move out of the truth, you feel it. Kinesthetically, you feel it in your body when you've disconnected. Have you ever had a conversation in which you said something that wasn't entirely real or entirely true? At that moment, if you're sensitive, you feel an energetic severing of the cord of connection. Correspondingly, when we move into the deep and intimate truth that arises from silence and stillness and love, then we feel a deep energetic connectivity and intimacy with the moment and with whomever and whatever is in that moment. This is how even our physical bodies help us to align with spiritual reality into the deeper dimensions of what's really true. When our bodies are suffering, when we feel internal conflict, then we know that we're not in balance. We're out of alignment with what is. Again and again, the mythic elements of this story actually mirror the journey of spiritual awakening and also mirror the moment to moment realities of our lives. Don't go through life unconscious. The story of saying, these moments are happening for you also in your daily life if you would simply notice. You're being asked to align yourself to the deepest reality within you, to realize it and to act from it. Finding the right orientation. As soon as Jesus comes out of the desert, he begins to gather his disciples. Now, in the ancient world, a disciple would have been considered an initiate, somebody who was essentially an insider. This theme runs through the whole story: insiders and outsiders, initiates and non-initiates. In the ancient world, each of the religions had a set of core stories, much like the story of Jesus. There are stories about the creation of the world, stories about the God-man, stories of exile and return. As happens today in many churches, the ordinary person was taught that these stories were essentially factual and historically accurate and true. Now, an initiate was one who studied with a teacher until the teacher deemed that they were ready to delve deeper into the mystery of their own religious perspective. At a certain point, the initiate would be told, "We told you that all these stories are historically accurate and historically true, but that viewpoint is really for the outsiders. That's all they can take and all they want to follow." Okay, that's all they can take and all they want to know. For them, it's good enough to have a story around with which to align their moral and ethical lives. But for you, for an initiate, the teacher would say, we're going to peel back the veil. We're going to show you what this story is really about. And at that point, one of the first initiations would be to show the disciple that whatever the religious story might seem to be on the surface, it was actually a metaphor for the spiritual journey. It wasn't necessary to believe that the story was factual because the story was conveying something more than fact and history. The story was conveying deep spiritual realities. It was meant as a mirror and a metaphor for what happens within you. Once you've received this deeper meaning, then you'd be an initiate. And this is Jesus' hope. This is his intention. And he starts to gather his disciples. He gathers 12 disciples to whom he'll transmit the deepest reality of existence. He hopes to transmit to them what he calls the kingdom of heaven, what I call awakening to divine being. That's Jesus' mission. He gathers his band of disciples around him. From this point on, the story becomes very fascinating as we see the development of Jesus' relationship with his disciples, as well as Jesus' discovering his true role and destiny in the world. Imagine that you've had a deep shift of consciousness. Imagine that you've suddenly realized that the person you thought you were your whole life wasn't really who you were. That the way you saw life wasn't really the way life was. That there was a transcendent reality upon which the whole world of forms and appearances rests, and from which it derives its existence. You've had this whole identity of yourself and the way the world works. And then you have a spiritual awakening where the spirit descends into you, and you suddenly realize that your identity is not limited to the body, the mind, or the personality, where there is a radiant spiritual reality within you. Many people think this sounds wonderful, that such an awakening would add a sense of freedom and ease to life, which it does. But that's not actually what spiritual awakening is all about. Spiritual awakening is a profound shift of consciousness that opens your entire relationship to life. There is a big reorientation that takes place in the wake of such titanic shift of consciousness. What do I do with my life? What's my role? What's my relationship with my friends, my family, my husband, my wife, my children? Your whole relationship with life starts to turn, and you don't initially know how you as a human being are going to fit into the picture. You don't know exactly what your role is going to be. Think of all the relationships in our lives and how we tend to orient ourselves around those relationships and the way we engage with them. Then imagine you've had a profound shift of consciousness that calls all these relationships into question. How am I going to relate with people now? What am I going to talk with them about? What happens now that I see that so much of what I based my own personal life on was little more than a dream, a fantasy, something I thought was true, but ended up not to be? This is a profound realization, and one that engenders a profound change of relationship with all of life. That doesn't just happen overnight. Throughout the Jesus story, we see Jesus discovering what his role is, how to teach, and what to teach. His first instinct is to do what was common at the time and place, to gather disciples, those who will become initiates, and try to transmit his teachings So to literally transmit his state of consciousness to them, that was the accepted method at the time. As we see throughout the story, that doesn't necessarily work out very well for Jesus. The disciples, it turns out, don't really understand any better than anyone else in the story. Jesus is a very charismatic figure. People are drawn to him because he represents the spiritual reality, the radiance of divine being. When one has fully realized divine being, something about that person becomes compelling. Such a one is no longer primarily a person, but a radiant presence. There's a type of charisma, different than the charisma of a celebrity or a public figure. It resonates deeply in the hearts of human beings because human beings resonate with one who shines with divine reality. People are also terrified by it because they don't know exactly what it is. They're drawn toward the radiance of awakened consciousness, but they also pull away because an awakened being is not predictable and they don't operate the way we might expect. Throughout the story, we'll see Jesus finding his role, gathering his disciples, and trying to transmit his realization to them. Becoming a healer and trying to teach through healing, telling parables and trying to teach through parables. Late in his life, he begins to realize that his teaching isn't healing. Late in his life, he begins to realize that his real teaching isn't healing, isn't to teach parables, isn't even to transmit the deeper reality to this group of disciples, because that doesn't really work out. At some point, he realizes that his real teaching is his life story. He himself is the teaching. But all of that will come later. For the moment, he gathers together his small band of disciples and goes out to heal the sick and preach repentance, which means to turn around, to have a change of heart. Christ Ki Jai, Mojiji Ki Jai, Anantaji Ki Jai.